Okay, welcome to the video tutorial for Form 35 Inspection Addendum. As with every addendum and my Form 21, I am confirming I have the most current revised form. This one is a revision date of July 2015, and as I'm recording this video in June 2016, this is the most current revised date, so I'm good to go. Line 1, I'm simply putting in the date of my agreement that I used on page 1 on Form 21. Just the date that I'm drafting the agreement is all this means. So I could put today's date in if I'm drafting my agreement today. I have my buyer and seller, of course my property. Now, box 1, inspection addendum. If I want this contract contingent on an inspection, and I'm assuming you do since you are going for a Form 35, you want to check this box. This means that this paragraph is part of the agreement. So this explains our inspection contingency. And also, this is a newer paragraph, the sewer inspection. This is where the buyer may or may not opt to conduct a sewer inspection, and if you don't select any box, the default as indicated here is may. So you can check may. That doesn't mean you have to. That doesn't mean your buyer has to do a sewer inspection. It just means they may, they can, they are allowed to. Buyer's obligations. Important to know, the buyer is the one who contacts the inspector and schedules the inspection. You do not do this for them. This is the buyer's responsibility and the buyer's obligation to do this. You just make sure they do it. So as we see here, our time period of 10 days, the buyer is obligated to do an inspection and submit a Form 35R, which is the inspection response form, within 10 days. So the time clock is ticking. This is not the time, once you have mutual acceptance, where your buyer goes on a 3-week cruise to Alaska. Things have to happen. The clock is ticking. You need to keep your buyer on task. We will hear shortly that if you don't keep your buyer on task and they go beyond these 10 days, then guess what happens? Right here, attention buyer. If you fail to give notice, you fail to submit a 35R, the inspection is waived and seller doesn't have to do anything. So you are buying the house and the seller doesn't have to do anything. So do not lose track of time and allow that to happen. So the buyer's notice, we have again 10 days. Now, do we count Saturday, Sunday, and legal holidays, or do we not? This is where you need to be very familiar with the computation of time paragraph in Form 21. So really have a good handle on that paragraph. That paragraph tells you when you count Saturday, Sunday, legal holidays, and when you do not. So 10 days, and in 10 days, within 10 days, we want to submit a 35R an inspection request, and I think it's appropriate to just kind of jump into that too in this video. So here is the 35R inspection response form for 35. This is, believe it or not, the most current revision date of July 2008. Buyer, seller, property address, the same date that I've used as I'm drafting this contract. So within 10 days you need to submit this form with one of these boxes checked. The buyer is either going to approve the inspection, and that means we're done with the inspection. We can't go back. We are done. We are agreeing to close. The buyer could disapprove of the inspection and terminate the agreement. The next sentence states the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer, but that's not going to necessarily happen because the seller is going to have to sign off on that. The language should say, and you should explain to your buyer that you are entitled to a refund of the earnest money. But that's a separate video explaining earnest money and how you get the earnest money back. Or the third box, which says buyer wants to make additional inspections. And where that would come up is you'll see in inspection reports, inspectors are always saying, recommend additional inspection on the roof, recommend an electrician inspect the electrical system, recommend additional inspection on the HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. The inspector is not a licensed HVAC technician, they're not a licensed roofer, they're not a licensed electrician. So they are, in an effort to cover themselves from liability, are saying, look, I'm not an electrician, I recommend you get one to look at the electrical system of this house, or the roof, or the HVAC, plumbing, etc. If that's the case, you check this box and you're asking for an additional inspection, and this is when you would have to attach the inspector's recommendation stating they recommend an additional inspection. An important note here, if you also have a list of things you want the seller to fix, do not ask for it now. Save it and wait until you do your additional inspection and then ask for it all at once. Do not ask for it now at the same time you're asking for an additional inspection, because then the seller could agree and they would agree to only fix those things you've stated and not agree to do anything related to an additional inspection. Or the last box the seller may check is, hey seller, I want you to do these 5 things. So you'd fill in the 5 things you're asking the seller to fix. So that is the first step with the 35R. We'll go back to the inspection form now, form 35. So we've submitted our 35R in these 10 days. We know we have to do it. Otherwise, if we go outside the 10 days, seller doesn't have to do anything and the addendum is waived, the contingency is waived. This is where this outlines how much time we have to do that additional inspection, again for the roof, HVAC, electrical, etc. This says 5 days. We are going to be using the defaults on all of these for this video. So we submit our 35R. Now we wait. What's seller going to do? So the default here is 3 days. So seller has 3 days to respond. This is where it starts getting tricky. This is where agents across the state are making mistakes because they don't understand this addendum. They don't understand how to compute time, how to count 3 days, and they are harming their buyers and they're getting in trouble for it. So pay attention to this. We're waiting now for the seller's response. What if, well, let me ask you first, 3 days, are we counting Saturday, Sunday, and legal holidays? You need to know that. Again, that's outlined in the computation of time paragraph in Form 21. I'll tell you, for the sake of this discussion, we are not counting Saturday, Sunday, legal holiday because it's only a 3 day time period. So we have 3 days. What if seller does not respond? Let's say seller's response period, the 3 days, ended Monday, and the default time is 9 p.m. That's the default time in the contract. So Monday 9 p.m. is the last day of this 3 day period. What position are we in now come Tuesday morning? Seller has not responded. The position we're in is explained here, buyer's reply period. And this is the second 3 day period. 3 days because we're using the default. Buyer now has 3 days. We are not counting Saturday, Sunday, legal holiday. So seller's reply period ended Monday 9 p.m. So buyer, you have 3 days. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday by 9 p.m. Buyer, you either have to decide you're going to buy the house as is. You need to decide, I'm going to terminate this contract, or within these 3 days, you need to get the seller to agree to something. So if in those 3 days you can't get the seller to agree to anything, let's say they're not responding, and you go past this 3 day period, again, which is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 9 p.m., let's say you go past this 3-day period, so you wake up Friday morning and you don't have an agreement with the seller, this paragraph here explains the situation you're in. And what it says is the inspection contingency is waived, seller does not have to do anything, and you are agreeing to buy the house. That would be a tough position to be in and a tough conversation to have with your buyer if that was not your intent and or your buyer's intent. And this is where agents are getting into trouble. So really pay attention to computation of time. Let's say the seller does respond within their 3 days. So they've responded, and let's go back to the 35R, and it lays it out pretty well here. The seller is going to respond with one of these 4 choices. They're either going to say, hey buyer, I agree with everything, let's close. We're done now, we are done with the inspection addendum. Or the seller could say, hey, you've asked for 5 things, but I'm only going to do 3 things. Or they could say, I'm not doing anything. Or they could say, I'm not doing anything, but instead, here's an alternative. Maybe I'll drop the price $2,000 or something like that. If the seller says anything but box 1, so if they check box 2, 3, or 4, buyer, you now have an opportunity to respond. And that's right here. You can either accept their response, you can say, no, I don't accept your response, and this agreement is terminated. Although this says the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer, be careful, because as we know, the seller is going to have to agree to release the money and how much to your buyer. So this language again should say buyer may be entitled to refund of the earnest money. Or the third box, hey, I don't like your response, seller, I don't accept it. Instead, could we do this? Now, if the buyer does that, keep in mind, you have to get agreement within that last 3-day period. And in our example, that was Thursday, 9 p.m., Tuesday to Thursday. One thing to take note of, if the seller rejects your proposal, this contract is not terminated. It's not dead. You're still in a contract. I've had listing agents take this response and then take it as the contract is dead, and then they turn around and sell the house to another buyer. You have just sold the same house twice, and that is a very bad situation to be in. So the contract is not dead here. So back to Form 35. We have now covered what happens here. That last 3-day period, whether the seller responds, we now have 3 days, unless they accepted everything, to figure it out or terminate. The time periods do not repeat, as outlined here. Paragraph D explains at what level how well are these repairs supposed to be made. And this explains it has to be done in a commercially reasonable manner. Okay? So this talks about how the repairs are to be made. This references storage tanks, on-site sewage disposal. If you're dealing with one, look at the septic addendum. It outlines the septic requirements there and things that need to be done. Paragraph 2, if you want it, check the box. If you want it contingent on neighborhood review, then you can check that box. This would be if you're doing a pre-inspection. This would be if you're waiving the inspection. That is Form 35 as well as 35R. I cannot stress enough that you need to understand computation of time, when you count Saturday, Sunday, legal holiday, when you do not, and don't be one of those agents that falls asleep at the wheel and the buyer's in a position where now they contractually are agreeing to buy the house and seller does not have to do anything. I hope this has helped. Of course, call me anytime. Thanks for listening.